Grace and peace in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Welcome to Wednesday Night Live at First Presbyterian Church in St. Petersburg, Florida. My name is Dawn Conti, and it is my joy to serve as the pastor for this congregation where our mission statement is to be and to make disciples of Jesus Christ who know the Lord and who through love serve God and others. One of the ways that we like to do that is by the renewing of our minds through educational opportunities at the church. And tonight we are continuing on with our social justice series. This is the sixth in a series of 12 meetings. And so thank you for all joining us tonight. I want to remind everyone that during the season of Lent, we are offering a Taizé worship service on Wednesdays at noon. It premieres at noon, but you can watch that at any time on our YouTube channel. Also, please join us at 10 a.m. for worship, which premieres on Sundays, which you can also watch at any time on our YouTube channel. During the season of Lent on Maundy, Thursday, we will be offering drive-through communion at the church from 1 to 3 p.m. So please come and join that out in the front circle of the church. And now I invite you to join me in prayer. Let us pray. Gather us in, Lord, as we come together in your name as your church. We give thanks for this day and all that it has held, for your constant presence with us, and for the abundant life that we have in your Son and our Lord Jesus Christ. Help us now to center our attention as we look forward to this hour of learning more about the history of social justice. We give thanks for and ask your blessing on Gary tonight as he shares with us. In this time and through this experience, we ask that you would strengthen and equip us to be your church. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Okay, thank you, Dawn. Just a moment to review the rules for Zoom meetings. I would ask while the speaker is presenting that you please mute your microphones so that we don't get extraneous noise. Also, when it's time for questions and answers, please either raise your hand manually or use the icon in the reactions. If you see the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, you press on that, and there will be a little raised hand as you see up here in the app. Now, you can of course lower your hand with the same button. You may also want to use the speaker view, where if you use the button, the view button in the upper right of your screen, you can click that, change to the speaker view, and you will see the person who is speaking at that time. Okay, now for tonight's presentation, I'll ask you to please hold your questions to the end because this is a very extensive program, and I think we'll have to move through it at a brisk pace. All right, tonight's program, we've got Gary Mormino going over the Great War and the view from Florida and the social justice movements that followed. All right, tonight I'll be sharing the screen. All right, we see it? Good? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Gary, I'm going to silence myself and wait for your cues.
Shall I begin? I'm on.
You're on.
Okay. Welcome. When 2014, 2015 rolled around, I was very curious. I've always been very curious about the Great War and American history. And I set out, it took me about a year to do this. I think I read every single newspaper from 1914 to 1918 in the Tampa and St. Petersburg papers. And I wrote several articles for the Tampa Bay Times. I'm not sure I ever mentioned the word social justice in any of those articles, but upon reflection for tonight's program, I realized that era is permeated with social justice. You can make an argument even more so than today, that period 1914, 1919 is an environmental, a racial, and ethnic immigrant feminist reckoning in American history. So next, please, let me show you some examples. Well, Florida in 1915, the war had begun in Europe. Florida had not yet reached 1 million persons. To put this in perspective, we're approaching 22 million today. And in the decade that followed is really the coming of age for Florida, but I'm not sure we would have had it without the Great War. Locally, Tampa is the big metropolitan area, 40,000 people, but St. Petersburg had about 7,200 people in 1915. A relatively small city, Jacksonville is the biggest city in Florida with 68,000. Miami is kind of on the dawn of a breakthrough, but Miami only has about 16,000 people. Next, please. I love how the St. Petersburg Daily Times, it was called then, it was obsessed with boosterism. And every year they would have a different item. But in 1914, they said St. Petersburg has 50 boarding houses, 33 hotels, 9 Protestant churches, 8 restaurants, 7 public parks, 6 barbershops, 5 bakeries, 5 police, 2 Chinese laundries, and maybe most remarkably, 1 Confederate veteran camp. How interesting. By the way, they didn't mention any Catholic churches. This was a very Protestant town. I think they had 1 Catholic church. Next, please. You could make an argument the oddest institution in St. Petersburg in 1914 was the GAR Hall. Many viewers probably won't recognize that name. That's an old-fashioned name. It meant Grand Army of the Republic. And following the Civil War, Union veterans in the North created kind of a vast fraternal club called the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. It was in many ways a stalking horse for the Republican Party. So think about this, that St. Petersburg in the deep Confederacy had basically an old age home for Union veterans. That building would have been burned down in Alabama or Georgia. And by the way, Florida had another one in Narcoossee, Florida. 2, actually. There was another one in Lynn Haven. So Florida had 3 Union veteran retirement homes. Next. You know, as remarkable as this seems, that St. Petersburg had a veteran of the Mexican War. It's not as outlandish as it might seem. The Mexican War had occurred in 1846, so 54, 64, about 70 plus years. World War II veterans now in Florida are 75. So World War II is further removed from us than the Mexican War from World War I. Next. St. Petersburg is a tourist city. It's certainly emerging as a tourist city, the undisputed tourist capital where the sun never fails and care is the only stranger. It is a boosterish paper. It's also a very prudish city. I spent most of my career studying Tampa. Tampa is the un-St. Petersburg, wild, woolly, ethnic. St. Petersburg tends to be rather homespun, much more Protestant, large African-American community in both places. Next. Now, this is fascinating. So this World War I in Europe has already begun, but not in the US. I wish we could have a discussion what this means. St. Petersburg has a custom. Each Thursday afternoon, stores closed at noon from May to October. And my interpretation of this is that, you know, money isn't everything. It's also, by the way, the off season, May through September. There aren't many tourists here, but why work when so few, enjoy the environment, enjoy the area. This is not a town obsessed with the Protestant work ethic. Next. On this prudish themes, The city fathers barred the tango in St. Petersburg. I think this was in 1916. I think that there is maybe 1914 at the bottom. Tango had been introduced from Argentina, Catholic Argentina, and it's part of a series of very strict moral compliances in St. Pete, whereas in Tampa, everything is wide open. And part of this is also to create a wholesome environment for Yankee tourists to come here. Next, as an example, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. What they were worried about is that tourists from the north were going to donate, quote, bad books, Peyton Place, the equivalent in 1915, to the local libraries. So they were censoring books here. You have to love the respect for the city. Next. St. Pete in 1915 was essentially dry, meaning it was prohibitionist, but the law meant that no new saloons would be sanctioned. And it was harder and harder for the saloons with license to operate. In 1915, 1914, there was I think it was called the Davis Act in Florida. There was a law of local option, county and local option. Cities could go dry even if neighboring cities were wet. Tampa was very wet. St. Petersburg was quite dry in comparison. Ybor, Don Vicente Martinez Ybor of Ybor City fame, threatened he would pull Ybor City away if Tampa ever went dry. Next. There was also what were called blue laws. Apparently in New England, the blue laws were written on blue paper. That's why they were called blue laws. But the idea was to respect the Sabbath, and that you weren't supposed to do anything fun on the Sabbath. It was supposed to be respectful. So in many communities, you couldn't play baseball. You couldn't go to movies. Taverns certainly weren't open on Sunday. And St. Pete soon voted yes on this question. Next. 1915, you also, the war in Europe had begun in June of 1914. By August, the guns of August, the war had begun. And one of the unintended consequences of the European war was that America was making a lot of money. So this is Tampa, Florida, TMT, it means Tampa Morning Tribune, that a prosperity parade, people, the cigar factories were selling all the cigars they could make to French, German, British concerns. There was more money on the American home front as the steel mills in Pittsburgh were ordering agricultural products from Florida, et cetera. Next. I just put this in here as a wonderful reminder that the stadium question in St. Petersburg has been longstanding. It doesn't begin in the 21st century, and this has to do with a spring training stadium. Next, please. This is extraordinary headline. This is the Tallahassee Daily Democrat. This also shows you how lonely I am that I'm reading the Tallahassee Democrat in 1915 on microfilm. But the legislature in 1915 decided that Florida would be a better place if we would disfranchise lawyers, black lawyers. By the way, this law never went into effect. The House passed it, but the Florida Senate did not. So this law never would. But the idea that they're even thinking of this tells you something. This is, we could have these wonderful parlor debates today. Is Florida a southern state? And if so, where does the South begin? Well, that debate wasn't being discussed in 1915. This was very much a southern state. It had been a slave state, it had been a Confederate state, it had been a Reconstruction state, and it was now a Jim Crow state, very much. Next. This is, I even hesitated to put this in there. This is so edgy, But in 1914, the St. Petersburg Evening Independent wrote, at the rate Negroes, by the way, you know, Negro is not capitalized. That was very typical of most Southern newspapers, that you would not capitalize Negro. At the rate Negroes are being killed by Tampa's police force, the race question soon will be resolved there. Wow, that is cold. I mean, that is just chillingly cold that you would, I suppose they were trying to make a joke, but it's not funny from our vantage point. Next. And on this point, in 1914, St. Petersburg had its only lynching. If you've been reading newspapers the last few weeks, this has gotten a tremendous amount of coverage. Tampa had about 6 to 8 lynchings. And it's fascinating, Tampa's greatest lynching occurred in 1910, and it was 2 Italians who were lynched. There were several hundred Italians lynched in the Deep South. But John Evans in 1914, I think on 9th Street South, was lynched. And they found years later this kind of tin the sign signifying this. Next, please. 1914 was an extraordinary year, by the way, for St. Petersburg. The war, forget the war, but in 1915 you had the Tony Janus flight, the first flight to Tampa, the beginning of kind of intra-city air express. You had the first spring training game. Really, you have in downtown St. Petersburg the beginnings of a modern downtown. This is kind of curious. The newspapers, I can hear the editorial ghost coming at me saying, you could not possibly understand what it was like in 1917. And here, this kind of a defense of race relations. We'll have more of this. Next, please. Now, curiously, Tampa had a rather large German community. They had a large German population. I've had a lot of debates with this. I would argue it was really not a German community as we define an immigrant community. Many of these Germans, in fact, are second-generation Germans. So there was never a identified German colony or neighborhood in Tampa, but it was a large number of Germans. And there was a rather handsome building they built called the German American Club, still standing on 7th Avenue on the edge of Ybor City. Next, please, I think is the building. That's the building. That's where you pay your water taxes and gas taxes. And we'll see the German club is shut down by the US government in World War I because of the anti-German hysteria. But that, I mean, they had a gym, they had a place where the Zangerfest could take place, the German singing festivals. And curiously, half of the members of the German American Club were Jewish, which seems odd from the vantage point of 2021, but a German Jew was quite proud to be German, kind of a national pride. They obviously could not have anticipated what's going to happen in the 1930s and 40s in Germany. Next. One of those events that changed the world, it's hard to, one of those before and after events, but in June of 1915, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria and his bride Sophie, he married a commoner. And the royal family is so angered by this. Ferdinand was not going to become the emperor. His father had been emperor for like 70 years, Joseph. And but they're trying to kind of tamp down sentiment in Serbia. And the Serbs were Slavs who did not like being under the yoke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And a Black Hand Society anarchist assassinated Sophie and Ferdinand in June 1915, essentially the fuse that set off the Great War. And what happens is it's like the first domino fell, and within a month, the alliance is set. It's going to be the Allies, or will be France, England, and Russia, curiously. I'm probably leaning, but the Central Powers, quote, the bad guys, will be Germany, Austro-Hungary, Bulgaria, and curiously, the Ottoman Empire. So that's going to be kind of and tiny Belgium is going to try to remain neutral. Next, please. And here, I sliced this together. The paper wasn't as awkward as it seems, but this is in this era, you didn't have many banner headlines. This is as big a banner headline as will ever be in the St. Pete Times. You'll see it's August 1914. The fighting has commenced. You know, it's interesting, by the way, to look back at this. I always like to tell my class that a young John Kennedy, President John Kennedy, in October of 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, happens to be reading Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, a book very critical that, you know, it's insane that they went to war. And John Kennedy, he took away from that book the idea that wars are created by humans, and that the lesson to be learned from World War I is everyone step back for a second and think about this. Do we really want to go to war? And he realized if he retaliated against the Russians and Khrushchev was going to push the button. It's in Khrushchev's DNA, and then we would have to retaliate. And if you remember, he kept giving Khrushchev a little extra room to kind of exhale. And next, please. All Europe involved in war. Next, please. I love that. Deluge of blood about to break. Wow. I mean, you can imagine people on their front porch reading the morning paper and just kind of shaking their hands and thinking, when will it come here? Next. And at this time, the local German community thought nothing of the idea of saying, you know, Germany is right in this war, and that England and France are the aggressors, and they had no idea of the pushback that's going to take place. They're going to be severely reprimanded and retaliated against. Next. For a newspaper, this is as great a publicity as you can imagine. People want to read about the news the next day, the next morning. What has happened on the battlefront? Ironically, I'm working on a study now of Florida, the first decade of the 21st century. And 9/11 had the opposite effect. Newspapers are already beginning to decline, but after 9/11, you didn't want to wait until the next morning to find out what happened. You wanted to know what happened 5 minutes ago. So it's CNN is going to be your source of news. Next, please. There are no atheists in the foxholes. So there's a tremendous, a great demand for Bibles to read. This is, by the way, when the U.S. is in the war, to make sure the doughboy takes a Bible to France with him. Next. During this period, Florida has an election. And you may think you've been through some wacky elections and seen some eccentric governors. No need to mention names. No, you have no idea. The most eccentric, strange, fascinating governor is a man by the name of Sidney Johnston Katz, named after a Civil War Confederate hero. You'll notice his symbol is the cat. And next, please. Katz runs on the primary on the Democratic ticket. Next, please. And it's almost certain he won the Democratic nomination, but the Democratic Party is worried about him. He is so radical. He has essentially two political platforms. One, I'm against Catholicism, and secondly, I'm for prohibition. There's an intense anti-Catholic fervor in America at this time. And Katz runs on a third party ticket, the Prohibition Party, and wins the election. Next. Next, please. His first act is he told the legislators as they were coming to Tallahassee, he would arrest and jail any legislator found drunk on the Tallahassee grounds. So you can see he's serious about prohibition. Next. During the war, he also institutes what's called work or jail. If you're not in uniform and you're not working, you could be jailed. You could be impressed to have to go and work someone's farm. Next. This is maybe the most interesting headline of tonight that I don't have the date. The date's at the bottom. But several months into the war, the Times said, you know, there's a war raging in Europe, but honestly, we can't tell here. And within days, or certainly months, St. Petersburg, Florida, America is just saturated by the war news. The war is affecting everything. Next. For the minister tonight, I'm curious to get your reaction to this. Is this the last time in St. Petersburg history every church in St. Petersburg filled to capacity? This is January 17. We're not even in the war yet. We get in the war in April. But wow, that also tells you a lot of tourists are coming to town. Next. Two things there. The biggest industry in Pinellas County is citrus. It will be so for decades and decades. And on the right there is that the public is buying cigarettes for the soldiers and giving them cigarettes. You basically have a generation hooked when they come home. Next. We can skip that. Go ahead. Next. This is Tampa. These are volunteers for the war in Tampa. And they even brought along their American bulldogs there, you can see, and children. Next. Three of my favorite World War I veterans in Florida, Spessard Holland, Sumter, I got this screwed up, by the way. It's Sumter Lowry on the left. Sumter Lowry Park is named for his father. He fought with Patton. Before the war, we sent an expedition to Mexico to hunt down Pancho Villa, and Sumter Lowry was there. Sumter Lowry returns, forms the American Legion in Tampa, runs for governor in the 1950s on the segregation ticket. The most famous was James Van Fleet in the middle. James Van Fleet is from Lakeland, becomes a general during World War II. He heads the Allied war against in Greece after World War II against the communists. He also, in the 1920s, was the director of ROTC at the University of Florida and coached the University of Florida football team. James Van Fleet has a better football record than Steve Spurrier. And on the far right is Spessard Holland. Spessard Holland was an aviator from Lakeland, also actually Bartow, and he becomes the governor and a U.S. senator in the 40s and 50s. Next. Environmental reckoning. This is one of those weird things about the war. Does this have anything to do with the war? Maybe, but Tampa Bay there's almost a daily article. What's going to happen if the food famine hits here? Because the French, the Russians, everyone in Europe is starving. What happened? It can happen here, and they encourage everyone to eat more fish. Tampa, except we don't know whether there was an El Nino effect, but for some reason, the fishing catches are way down. And in times of crisis and tension, you need a scapegoat. And the scapegoat in 1918, 1917 is the pelican. They blame the pelican for eating all the fish. And the fishermen start killing hundreds, if not thousands of pelicans. And now, how do you arrive at the figure of $3,007,600? That's an interesting. But on the other hand, a new group has emerged to defend the pelican, and that is St. Petersburg women, particularly the Audubon Club in St. Petersburg, newly organized. Next. This is a debate. You can see. And this is really, you might argue, the first time the environment made the front pages, that people were concerned about our relationship with nature. And amid the cancel culture of today, I've often wondered, so 100 years from now, what are people going to think of our generation in 2021? And it might be the one downfall we may have as a group is our relationship with animals. But next. No. To reinforce the food distribution, Woodrow Wilson names Herbert Hoover the food czar. He becomes the U.S. food administrator. You can make an argument. He is the one American who comes away from the war unblemished. He is a millionaire engineer, graduate of the first class at Stanford, and he did this for $1 a year. And after the war, he saves many, many people from starving to death. Next. This is maybe my favorite stumble upon editorial. Why would there be an editorial in the St. Petersburg Independent, the afternoon paper, in 1917 entitled Eat Grouper? And you'll note the second paragraph, grits, the residents here rather scorn grouper either as a sporting fish or for food. Next. For the first time in the history of St. Petersburg, grouper has found a market this winter. Now, this is social justice, a grouper sandwich. Tell me that's not social. But basically, we were overfishing mackerel, red snapper, all the more desirable fish, and they were having to eat grouper as kind of the standby. In reality, grouper, if properly cooked, is as good as any fish that can be found. Wow, that's weird. Next. A trolley ad with the first sentence, it's possible that Americans may be warned to keep off foreign ships, but there can be no objection to riding our own trolley cars. You have a lot of this advertising using the German war as a reason you should ride the trolley car from St. Petersburg to Gulfport. Next. There's a lot of patriotism boils over. This is also right at the time we entered World War I. So at the park, that only means one thing, Williams Park. Thousands of people go there to say pledge allegiance, pray for the soldiers. We're really swept into this war once we get into it. Next. On an industrial level, we have no influence at all. There's one industry, quote, industry in Pinellas County. It's a marmalade factory in Largo. Marmalade will win the war. Next. Next. The big industry in Tampa is shipbuilding. I'm going to kind of skip over that. That's Tampa. Next, please. ICE. Do you think of ICE as freedom or slavery? Germany is fighting to enslave mankind, but you still have the freedom to buy ice in St. Petersburg. Next. Now what's fascinating about this, I also found this in World War II. I wonder if this is really an event or it's a metaphor. The story is a woman in St. Petersburg was riding on a streetcar, and she was working during the war. So she had on her work gear, and a woman next to her says, I know this sounds awful, but I hope the war goes on because my husband has the best job he's ever had. And apparently she slapped her saying, that's for my husband who died at the Argonne Mews. Next. The mirth of World War I. Now, I'm not into sexual imagery, but what do I know about this? Next. This is kind of the village people in 1918. Next. I'm glad American history majors don't read that. Next. Don't you love that? I mean, that's my favorite World War I image. Next. The guilt of World War I. So this is a guy who made a lot of money during the war, and 20 years later, his daughter is saying, Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? Next. The use of ethnicity in World War I. That's a roll call of recent immigrants. And they're trying to make the point we're all in this together. It's rarely true, but this is from the Washington perspective. Next. This is scary. Volunteers needed to run down slackers near Tam. A slacker is someone who's not participating in the war as a worker or as a soldier. Next. They found the slacker and made him kiss the American flag. Wow, this is, you can see this is getting too serious. Oswald Williams, a very German name. Next. Next. You know, we think of the Star-Spangled Banner as something, the protest began in 2018. It began during a World Series game during World War I. And even then there was some pushback. Next. Bomb plotters in Tallahassee. Next. This is St. Petersburg. So there's a meeting of 12 businessmen. They meet secretly to try basically questions of disloyalty of St. Petersburg citizens. Ouch. Next. A teacher in St. Petersburg, Ms. Heidrich Schaefer, very German, students turned her in. They thought she was being disloyal, and she's fired, by the way. Next. The Rom family was in the fishing business. They're German. They also have to defend themselves. The irony of this, German Americans on the eve of World War I were the ideal immigrants. Italians, Poles, they were the worst immigrants, but Germans, they were patriotic. They learned German quickly. They were industrial, hard, patriotic. The public turned on the German. The German became the Hun almost overnight. Next. You couldn't have this headline today. Next. Movies. The Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin, Ach im Himmel. Next. The state legislature, in their wisdom, one way of combating this is to forbid the teaching of German in schools, which they did. Next. How cold do you have to get? There's also a simmering racial situation in Florida. And there was an old law on the books that whites could not teach black students. And they arrest 6 nuns in St. Augustine for teaching black students. Wow, that's cold, cold. Next. Probably the most racist film, or certainly the greatest racist film, Birth of a Nation. Woodrow Wilson said it was like history written with lightning, appears at the local theaters during the war. Next. History taught on the screen. Next. Yet on the same things going on, you could argue the most patriotic group in St. Petersburg and Tampa is the African American community. There was a feeling that As Frederick Douglass has said, nothing gives a group more respect than chevrons on the sleeve. And they turned out believing if we support our country and are patriotic, things will change after the war. And things did change for the worse. Next. Next. Now this, I think this is the most interesting subplot going on. So if you were a black woman living in anywhere in the South, but especially locally, unless you were a nurse or a teacher, and there was a small number, most African-American women worked as cooks, domestics, or laundresses. Terrible work, no benefits. And during the war in St. Petersburg, quote, Negro women form a union, and they want more money per day. Next. This doesn't go well. The mayor of St. Petersburg, kind of a saint, name, Al Lang, father of spring training. He wants to know who this is, and he wants to know who the white person is who organizes, because certainly no black woman could do this on her own. Next. And he's warning them, you could go to jail if you continue this. Next. And the woman, I think her name was Lily Abrams. No one knows who she was. I've asked several people. And she explains to the press the reason we wanted more money, $5 a week, by the way, was what they wanted. The reason we wanted more money, we wanted to buy war bonds. Good answer, by the way. Next. And another racial reckoning, and this is the most important movement during the war at all. This is called the Great Migration. 99% of ex-slaves and their children lived in the South after the Civil War. There was really no opportunity to go elsewhere. What happened during the war? For the previous 60 years, all the industrial work in the North had been done by Irish mill hands, Italian carpenters, Polish foundry workers, Serbian unskilled laborers. Those groups are gone. They're fighting in Europe. No one can immigrate during the war, and there's suddenly a scarcity of labor. And unions from the North and agents from the North are coming to places like St. Petersburg to recruit black workers. There's a serious pushback from this. The mayor is claiming he will arrest any labor agent. Next. But you can't, this is a movement that's irresistible. There's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And this is the going north. Next. In Tampa, they decided, this is the greatest movie made in Tampa Bay. And if any single viewer knows what it is, I'll be stunned. It was called Making of the Race, or Making of the Great Race, I think was the name of it. It was done by kind of an NAACP conglomerate, and it was supposed to be a response to D.W. Griffiths. And this was, the set was built on the Sulphur Springs site of the Hillsborough River. And you had thousands of Tampa extras, African Americans, playing in this. The movie was terrible. It got bad reviews, but it was a great idea. Next. Next. Even children are involved in the war effort. Why hickory nuts? They burn the chicory nuts to charcoal, and they use the charcoal in gas masks for American soldiers. Peach pits as well. Next. 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 We'll go. Let's go. Next. The war empowers a kind of movement that already has muscle. Women's suffrage began in the late 19th century, really in the Great Plains, and has spread. And that's one of the fascinating things about World War I. You have this, it's almost like the war is a pressure cooker for 3 or 4 movements race, environment, and ethnicity. All of these, you have tremendous repercussions out of this. Next. Women of St. Pete to insist. Women didn't insist on the ballot 10 years earlier. This tells you something that the movement is growing in intensity. Next. A suffrage rally. By the way, the 19th Amendment passes, but the Florida legislature votes it down. Sidney Katz, curiously, is in favor of it because of his wife. But I'm not making this up, the Florida legislature finally ratified the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote in 1971. Whoa. Next. Next. This is an extraordinary editorial. I mean, if you consider how conservative Southern newspapers were, particularly regarding the women's question, as it was called, I'll allow people to read that on their own. That is such a it also tells you the Times is becoming a progressive paper. There's still blind spots. Race is one of them, but this is, and I realize I misspelled branches there. Anyone wants a copy of that, I can give them. Next. Florida Methodist is also becoming a religious movement. Each church is taking a stand. You can't ignore this. Next. And Tony Janus, interestingly, dies on the Black Sea, not far after this. Next. We'll go through the USS Tampa sank during World War I, killing lots of Tampa youth, but I know you're more interested in St. Petersburg, so just go over these images. Next. Here you see the local one here. As my colleague Ray Arsenault wrote about, there is a World War I memorial at Williams Park, and what's interesting is the black soldiers who died, they have an asterisk next to their name. I'm surprised no one's gone after that to change that marker, but next. Peace. Next. Armistice Day is the happiest day in St. Petersburg history. Many of your viewers may think, historians are such a drag. They only talk about tragedy and racism and nativism. World War I, the end of World War I internationally, but especially at home, is an incredible safety valve. There've never been, first of all, it's the first war that's ever happened that there's spontaneous news. We know about it minutes after the European peace is over. And everyone went downtown to Williams Park. Next. Coming Home. The Odyssey is the first novel ever written, and that poignant scene when Odysseus, everyone thinking he's dead, he's been gone decades, and his great haunting question is, has Penelope been loyal to me? And he comes as a beggar, and of course the only one who recognizes him is his dog Argos that dies soon, and Penelope was faithful, by the way. Next. Kind of interesting, the first Thanksgiving after the war, turkey too high for most folks. Next. Let's do one more. You can see, read this. Tampa is happy. Not since the dawn of history has a dawn so fraught with happiness the general world over as Tampa. I mean, this gives you an idea of how they thought of World War I. There would never be anything quite like this. And who could have imagined that 23 years later, America is going to be in another world war. And of course, this was never known as World War I. This was the Great War. It's not World War I until there's a World War II. How are we doing time-wise? I assume I've exhausted all my time. You want me to take questions now?
Okay. Well, if you'd like, I mean, we've got a little bit of time. We could go.
Okay, good. We'll go through this. If I see any of these that's worth discussing at length, I will. Go ahead. Just about 5 seconds each. You can see we won the Great War, but the peace is going to be bitter. This is actually Armistice Day. There's already revolution in Berlin. The Spartacists, the far left groups are clashing. This, of course, is the seedbed for fascism and Nazism. Next. There's also, this is going to be viciously put down because many of the phosphate workers are black. And it's Polk County. Next. This is also rather chilling. During the war, you have a real counter reaction against the left in America, particularly because in events after the Bolshevik Revolution. And people are saying, it could happen here. Look at Emma Goldman, look at all those Russian communists, a lot of Italian anarchists in America. And they jailed during the Red Scare, 1919-1920, they jailed thousands of people, and the most incorrigible they put on a boat and sent to Russia, including Emma Goldman. Next. Those of you who've been to Chinsigid Hill think, what is this doing here? We've had so many happy memories at that place. But the owner of that place, whose name is escaping me right now, Raymond Robbins, he was one of 2 Americans in Moscow during the Russian Revolution. And he was living in Hernando County. And he comes home from the war. He was very close to Lenin, by the way. And Lenin gave him an acorn to plant for harmony between the United States and Russia. And by 1950, the acorn was a sturdy oak. And the Brooksville Boy Scout troop came and chopped it down because it was a communist oak. Next. Here's Raymond Robbins in Moscow. There's Comrade Robbins there. He is guilty, by the way. Look at that. Well, what a story. Well, he was considered one of the great experts on the new Soviet system. But next. Next. During World War I, the first national highway north-south is being built, the Dixie Highway, and you can see it's already in St. Augustine by 1918. Next. Sad, hold your ears if you don't want to hear this. World War I was the last war. Horses and mules had an important role. The automobile and truck were relatively useless and in the mud over there. When the war ends, what do you do with all those horses and mules? Most were turned into dog food, by the way. That was kind of the beginning when we started feeding Puss and Fluff and Precious cat food and dog food. Next. Next. That's kind of touching. I mean, think about this. When's the last time you saw a mule? A mule is almost a vanished institution in Florida. Maybe some farm zoos, but next. You can always tell a Faulkner novel, the mule dies, is the punchline. And to remind you, we're not the only ones to have made it through a pandemic. The Spanish influenza, by the way, was much, much more deadly than the coronavirus. I think it killed about 1 of 2 victims at this time. And it too hit places like Ybor City, Black communities far more than affluent communities. And the problem then is the germ theory was just getting started. We just didn't have a lot of knowledge about this at this time. Next. It's called Spanish influenza, by the way. Spain was about the only neutral power in Europe. So Spain was the only nation printing anything about this deadly flu in the newspapers because the others didn't want to give their enemies knowledge of what was going on. So everyone assumed the disease began in Spain. This is a remarkable story, St. Augustine record, and you can see my typos here, but for the first time probably in the history of St. Augustine, churches, schools, and theaters have been closed and public meetings canceled. We're talking about a community that began in 1565. They had many smallpox epidemics, yellow fever epidemics, and yet it was laid low by Spanish influenza. Next. Colleges, Southern College. The difference here is Southern College, Florida Southern College in 1918 was not in Lakeland, but it was in Pinellas County at what is today Palm Harbor, but was then called Sutherland. And the flu in part killed any opportunity that was going to stay in Sutherland. So after the war, they had basically a public auction. The highest bidder will get Florida Southern College, and Lakeland bid the most. Higher ed was easier in those days. Next. Well, this is a little cold. So Christian, how far does Christian charity go? Should we ship food to the starving Germans? And the sentiment overwhelmingly is no. Das ist aber schade, as they say in German. That's too bad. Ach in Himmel. Next. The first publicized genocide in history takes place during the Great War in Armenia. The Turks, the Ottoman Empire is crumbling. Turks too like to blame a scapegoat. It must be the Christian Armenians who are the fifth column. That term hadn't been invented yet, but they either starved or killed almost 1 million Armenians, and the Turks to this day have not accepted responsibility. Their argument is we too suffered terribly, which is true, but they too deserve blame. This is still a simmering issue. Next. America caught religion dramatically after the war. One of the greatest evangelists who spent a lot of time after the war was Reverend Billy Sunday, the greatest evangelist in the world, it reads there. And he had been an ex-baseball player. And when they introduced him, he would come in his suit coat and he would slide into the podium and he would sprinkle his sermons with baseball metaphors. It's a 3-2 count in the 9th inning. The devil is going to throw you a curveball. Will you be able to hit it? And during this particular evangelical tour, Babe Ruth, then playing for the Boston Red Sox, hit what many people believe the longest home run ever hit at Plant Field in Tampa. Next. 1920 is an extraordinary year in Florida history and American history. There's a revulsion against the Democratic Party and Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations. And Warren Harding has one of the greatest campaign slogans ever, a return to normalcy. He actually misread the word normality, but normalcy has become a word, and really did not have to campaign. And it's not just a Republican sweep. For the next 8 years, the Republicans will hold the highest office. In Florida, that racial harmony that veterans came back hoping for social justice evaporated in smoke in Ocoee outside Orlando in 1920. when a veteran went to vote, a black veteran, and they asked for his poll tax. We said, I was in France, I could hardly pay my poll tax, and they sent him away. He returns with a gun, and he's wearing his World War I uniform, touches off a race riot. The black community of Ocoee is almost wiped out. Next. This is kind of touching. I remember looking in the archives of the clippings of World War I in the St. Pete Public Library. And there was a group in St. Petersburg as late as the 1970s, World War I veterans, and they had a last man's club. They would meet every year at Armistice. They had a special bottle of Scotch or French champagne, and the last veteran would get that champagne. And I think the last veteran died about 20 years ago in all. And very soon, by the way, I'm predicting in about 2 years, we're going to have a countdown for World War II vets. I think there's about 275,000 left, but the youngest World War II vet is 95. Do the math. Next. So you can see social justice permeates this World War I experience. It's the first time an environmental issue really flared up. So do animals have rights? Do pelicans have rights? And what about women's suffrage? And then you had, after the war, I didn't have any images on this, but there is a vicious anti-immigrant rebound. And by 1924, essentially, no Southern or Eastern European immigrants could come. We're back to kind of a closed door policy. So, you wouldn't think World War I would have much social justice, but even in St. Petersburg, the issue kind of permeates the era.
All right. Gary, thank you so much. That was very informative and
more than you ever wanted to know.
Well, Gary, I'm going to start the questions with a simple one. We see a lot of the same themes that we see today. We've got a nation weary of war. We've got a nation coming out of pandemic. We've got issues with women's rights, the rights of minorities, the rights of immigrants. And we saw what happened in the Roaring 20s. And we see the backlash that happened against those movements. What do we think we might be in for this time around?
Man, does anyone have a clue? I mean, if you think about it, you're absolutely right. That ugly period of the war and the aftermath in Florida is succeeded by, in America, by freedoms people could not have imagined. Women drinking at bars, the right to vote, the new freedoms of young men and women everywhere. Now you don't really see that in terms of race, but now it's also pretty much middle class. Working class immigrant children weren't flappers generally. We're talking about a middle class, but you had a huge middle class in America, and people were buying cars and radios, unimaginable luxuries just a few years earlier. So it did lead to one of the most prosperous and confident period, but it's also an illusion in a lot of ways. There are two 20s. There's the 20s of the jazz age, the gin houses, these new opportunities, new freedoms, new technologies. There's also the tribal 20s. The Ku Klux Klan is never more powerful than about 1924, 25. And by the way, its strength is not Georgia or Alabama, it's Indiana and Ohio. Indiana, in fact, was the strongest Klan chapter. The governor of Indiana, Governor Stevenson, is the grand dragon of the Klan in Indiana. But the enemy is not necessarily in the Midwest, African Americans. The real enemy is the Catholic Church, and there's even a counter movement in the profession saying there were some good aspects of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I know, don't quote me on this. For instance, the Klan, if it found out that someone was beating his wife, the Klan would take care of that, kind of extra legally. The Klan held circuses. It was kind of a middle class institution in much of the South. So there's a tribal 20s as well, with lynchings and the Klan. I'm probably leaving some, but you get the picture. It's complicated. History is complicated.
We have more questions from the field. Jim.
We know partly from history, and I'm certainly not a historian, that pandemics and tremendous crises are often linked with extremist behavior. And Gary, you're showing us how that happened during and after World War I. And we're seeing that now after the pandemic, that the QAnons and all of these kinds of really extremist behavior and the backlashes against ethnic groups and so on. So again, we have that contrasted with another phenomenon, that change tends to occur out of incredible crisis that forces people to rethink the way we do things, and that, you know, the good side of this, countervailing perhaps the extremism, is the opportunity to make incredible breakthroughs with climate stability and equality of opportunity and so many others. And I'm just interested in how you see this playing out, and are you picking a winner yet in this kind of fight?
Well, you're absolutely right. In almost every pandemic or vast social movement, there are consequences. You know, to toss out a more comforting idea, and I really think there's a possibility of this, especially in Florida. I think Floridians during all this, we appreciate nature more than we ever did before. In part, it's one of the few places you can go and feel comfortable, and there's kind of a soothing quality. I would hope when the new normal returns, there is a re-energized environmental movement that we need to think about. You know, it used to be this idea, people accepted the idea that the most noble thing an individual could say, a father could say, is, I want to leave this place better for my children. Does anyone think that's happening today, particularly in the environment? I mean, it's scandalous, and it's getting worse rather than better. So I have hopes that there's going to be a spirited environmental counter movement, kind of the environmental Protestant movement. But then what do I know?
Oh, I see Linda has the next question.
Yes, let me unmute myself. I did not see any reference in the headlines that you showed to the Native American population. What was happening with them in this era?
You know, I have a Florida World War I PowerPoint that I do talk about that. And that's really an interesting question. It might be that period from about 1860 to about 1920 is that period. The good news is that civilized Florida is pretty much leaving the Indians alone. There's probably 1,000 to maybe 1,500 Seminoles and Miccosukees, but they're living in isolation in Big Cypress and the Everglades. And it's interesting, in 1927, that period of kind of splendid isolation is shattered when we start building the Tamiami Trail, which goes from Tampa to Miami, and it goes through the heart of the Seminoles. I also have a PowerPoint on the Spanish influenza, and it's a tragic tale, I hate to tell you. There was a hunting party during World War I, and it took a lot of initiative to hunt in the Everglades. I mean, there were no roads. You had to go by canoe. They were going by truck and car and then canoe. And it turned out one of the hunters had the fever, the Spanish, and they interacted with Seminoles. And the Seminoles, there was no group in Florida died in greater numbers than the Seminoles because of that one infection. They had no immunity. They had even less immunity than most Americans. So in the 20s, the Seminoles kind of come out of isolation because they have to, because all these cars are going across this Tamiami Trail in the late 20s. And they begin a new economy. They're making pelts for the tourist. They're having alligator wrestling for the tourist, making us believe that this is an ancient Seminole tradition. So it's an interesting question, but the answer is there's not much. There were one or two veterans, I believe. The Seminoles were exempt, but a few veterans did volunteer.
Okay.
A few Seminoles volunteered. But I don't have, there's not a expansive answer to your question, which is good news for the Seminoles.
All right, thank you. All right, I am not seeing other questions at this point. So I'm going to say thank you so much and take one moment to tell you about some of the upcoming programs that are lined up. Just today, I've got confirmation after Easter. We've got Charlie Justice, the county commissioner, who's going to speak to us about activities and social justice issues that's handled at the county level. Don Conte is going to talk to us about the inauguration prayer. Ivy Locadito, Ivy Husan, is actually working with the PCUSA at the United Nations Council on the Status of Women. She's at a major conference this week and next week, and is really excited about talking to her home church about all the things she's doing. We also have CASA. CASA is Community Action Stops Abuse, and we're going to be talking about domestic violence. This is something that during the pandemic I've heard has gotten worse, and it is definitely an issue of empowering families and people to escape domestic violence. I'm not confirmed yet, but I'm also trying to get the last session with the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department to talk about police reform. Hopefully I can get that confirmed. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. I would like to just end us in a brief prayer. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayers. We thank you, Lord, for the lessons we learned from history, the looking back to see the cause and effect, the ebb and the flow, and to recognize the patterns in the world we live. Lord, we hope that we learn from the past and we get that resurgence of faith that came after the war, and maybe not necessarily some of the other things that came in the war. Lord, hear our prayers. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.